Che Guevara, the revolutionary. A cinematic journey through the life of an icon. The air at the San Isidro Nautical Club hung heavy with salt and summer heat on that afternoon in 1930 when a small boy began to choke. His parents watched in horror as their 2-year-old son clutched at his throat, face turning colors no parent should ever witness, desperate for oxygen that wouldn't come. Ernestito, they called him then, a diminutive name for a child who would grow to cast one of the longest shadows of the 20th century. This was not just an asthma attack. This was the beginning of a lifelong war between a man and his own body, a war that would forge steel where others might have found only weakness. Polluted on June 14, 1928, in Rosario, Argentina, Ernesto Guevara de la Serna entered a world of privilege that would eventually become a cage he spent his life trying to escape. His father's side descended from 12 generations of Argentine nobility, while his mother brought extensive property and distinguished lineage to the union. They were the kind of family whose names appeared in society pages, whose summers were spent at exclusive clubs, whose futures seemed written in old money and older traditions. But young Ernesto's lungs had other plans. Camouflage came like a demon that refused exorcism. His mother, Celia, who had battled the same respiratory curse in her own childhood, understood the mathematics of genetic probability and the weight of maternal guilt in equal measure. 1 in 3 children might inherit her affliction. Ernesto drew the unlucky number. The family became nomads in their own country, chasing climates that promised relief, moving from Buenos Aires to Alta Gracia in Córdoba province, searching for air thin and dry enough to let their son breathe without agony. For 5 years they wandered, until they settled in the foothills of the Córdoba Sierra, where the altitude offered some mercy. Affordability devoted herself to young Ernesto with an intensity that bordered on obsession, teaching him at home when school became impossible, filling his mind with books when his body betrayed him. During endless hours confined to bed during asthma attacks, the boy devoured Freud and Neruda, London and Marx, building an intellectual foundation that would support revolutionary ideas his aristocratic lineage never intended. His mother's library became his university, her devotion his fuel. Years later, people would wonder where this fierce determination came from, this refusal to acknowledge limitation. They needed only to look at those early years, at a child who learned that willpower could transcend physiology, that the mind could command the body to do what lungs said was impossible. When the Spanish Civil War erupted in 1936, 8-year-old Ernesto found a new obsession. His uncle-in-law worked as a war correspondent, and the Guevara home became a gathering place for Spanish Republican veterans fleeing Franco's fascism. The boy listened with bright eyes as men with haunted faces spoke of battles against tyranny, of standing against overwhelming odds, of fighting for something larger than oneself. He placed small flags on maps, tracking the conflict with an attention to detail that foreshadowed the military strategist he would become. In the backyard, he and other children dug foxholes and cried out battle slogans, playing at revolution while the world burned. These were not idle childhood games, they were rehearsals. His condition forced creativity in all things. Take rugby, that most brutal of sports where grown men collide like freight trains and breathing becomes a luxury between crushing tackles. Any rational person with asthma would have avoided such a pursuit. Ernesto played anyway, earning himself the position of scrum half and the nickname Fuser, a contraction of El Furibundo, and his mother's surname, de la Serna. The rage within him, the fury at his own limitations, the anger that would later find political expression, all of it poured out on that rugby field. His teammates marveled at how he would play until an attack forced him to the sidelines, where he would inject himself with adrenaline right through his clothes, sometimes to call attention to his struggle, sometimes simply to survive. Then he would return to the game, wheezing and determined, proving something to himself that the world would later understand. Ernesto Guevara did not accept defeat from any opponent, including his own body. The family eventually moved to Córdoba for his education at the Dean Funes National School, where discrimination found no tolerance and liberal thinking flourished. He commuted 35 kilometers daily, developing friendships that would last through medical school, reading everything he could grasp. At 14, with his father's permission, he and his younger brother Roberto worked the grape harvest at a nearby vineyard. The brothers labored for several days before Ernesto's asthma forced a premature end to their agricultural adventure. When the farm owner refused to pay them for the days worked, arguing they hadn't honored their full commitment, young Ernesto learned another lesson that would echo through his revolutionary years. Those who own the land rarely show mercy to those who work it. In 1947, when his paternal grandmother, Ana Isabella Lynch, fell terminally ill in Buenos Aires, Ernesto immediately left Córdoba to be with her. He was 19 years old, already thinking about medicine, already sensing that healing and revolution might not be separate callings, but two expressions of the same fundamental rage against suffering. His grandmother's death marked another transition. The boy who had fought asthma in the foothills was becoming the man who would fight injustice across continents. But first, there would be a road, and that road would change everything. In January 1952, a medical student, one semester away from completing his degree, made a decision that defied all logic and every expectation. Ernesto Guevara, 23 years old, climbed onto the back of a sputtering Norton motorcycle, nicknamed La Poderosa, and aimed it north. His companion was Alberto Granado, a biochemist 6 years his senior, who shared his hunger for adventure and his growing disgust with the world's inequalities. Their plan was simple and magnificent. Traverse South America, work in a leper colony in Peru, witness what their privileged upbringings had shielded them from, and return transformed. They succeeded beyond any measure they could have imagined, though not in ways they expected. La Poderosa, despite its grandiose name meaning the mighty one, proved neither mighty nor particularly powerful. The motorcycle's gears were worn, the ignition barely functional, the frame requiring constant repair. Granado's mechanical interventions consisted largely of swift kicks and optimistic applications of tape. But they rode anyway, two young men with more ideals than practical sense, carrying minimal money and maximum hope. From the moment they departed Córdoba, almost crashing into a streetcar during their endless farewell, the journey announced itself as one part adventure, one part disaster, and entirely transformative. Their first stop was Miramar, where Ernesto's girlfriend, Chichina, summered with her upper-class family. 2 days stretched into 8. She lent him $15 to buy her a swimsuit in the United States, and Ernesto swore he would starve rather than spend that money on anything else. It was a promise he would eventually break, but its making revealed something about the young man he still was. Romantic, well-meaning, not yet hardened by the realities he was about to encounter. The journey proceeded south into Patagonia, then north through Chile. Along the way, La Poderosa accumulated miles and problems in equal measure. In the town of Lautaro, after an accident requiring repairs, they were invited to a dance. The evening ended badly when Ernesto was caught attempting to seduce a married woman. An angry mob chased them out of town. They left with haste and a lesson. Revolution, even of the personal variety, has consequences. In Santiago, La Poderosa finally surrendered to entropy and refused all further coaxing. The two men decided to continue by hitchhiking, their mode of transport now dependent on the kindness of strangers and their own resourcefulness. It was here, freed from the burden of a dying motorcycle, that Ernesto's political consciousness truly began its awakening. They made their way into mining country, to the Chuquicamata copper mine, where they witnessed an empire of extraction that laid bare the machinery of exploitation. Chuquicamata was the world's largest open-pit mine, a vast wound in the earth that produced Chile's wealth while its workers lived in conditions that mocked the very idea of human dignity. The mine was run by United States monopolies, and for many it stood as a symbol of foreign domination, of resources flowing north while misery remained south. One evening, Ernesto and Alberto encountered a homeless communist couple searching for mining work. By the light of a single candle, the workers' faces showed what words could never fully capture: the grinding poverty that was not accidental but structural, not unfortunate but engineered. Years later, Ernesto would write about that encounter, about frozen figures in the desert night hugging each other for warmth, about understanding viscerally that these people were not aberrations, but representatives of a proletariat that existed in every corner of the world. Peacefully, there through Peru, where they spent time at the San Pablo leper colony on the banks of the Amazon. The experience there profoundly affected both men, but Ernesto's response hinted at the revolutionary he was becoming. He saw how treating patients as human beings, rather than diseased animals, provided psychological benefits that medicine alone could never achieve. On his 24th birthday, with doctors and nurses as his audience, Ernesto gave his first political speech, advocating for a unified Latin America. His words carried a conviction born from months of travel. Latin America's division into competing nationalities was fiction, an artifice that served colonial powers but betrayed the people who actually lived on this vast and suffering continent. From Peru, they traveled to Colombia and Venezuela, witnessing everywhere the same patterns of exploitation and resistance, of wealth concentrated in few hands while masses struggled for basic survival. By the time Ernesto returned to Buenos Aires via Miami, where an airplane engine failure forced a 20-day stay, he was no longer the medical student who had departed. Something fundamental had shifted. In his diary, he wrote words that revealed his transformation. "I will be on the side of the people. I will take to the barricades and the trenches, screaming as one possessed, will stain my weapons with blood, and mad with rage, will cut the throat of any vanquished foe I encounter." These were not idle threats or rhetorical flourishes. They were a vow. The road had shown him that the injustices he witnessed were not accidents or failures of individual character, but systemic features of capitalism and imperialism. Medicine alone would never cure what ailed Latin America. Surgery required different instruments, and Ernesto was beginning to understand what those instruments would be. He returned to Buenos Aires, completed his medical degree in June 1953, and almost immediately set out again. The wanderer now had both qualification and direction. He traveled through Bolivia, where he witnessed a nationalist revolution that had seized power in 1952, observing its attempts at reform and its compromises with foreign capital. Then, on Christmas Eve 1953, he arrived in Guatemala City, where his education in the brutal realities of empire would reach its bloody culmination. Guatemala in 1953 was conducting a dangerous experiment, attempting democracy in a hemisphere where the United States preferred compliant dictatorships to independent nations. President Jacobo Arbenz had been democratically elected in 1951 and promptly began implementing land reforms that threatened the most powerful interests in the country. The United Fruit Company, that great octopus of American corporate power, owned vast territories that it kept mostly idle, holding land in reserve for when its currently farmed areas became depleted. Arbenz's reforms aimed to expropriate idle land and redistribute it to landless peasants. The proposal included compensation based on tax values and government bonds, but to United Fruit, this looked like theft. To impoverished Guatemalans, it looked like justice. Ernesto arrived in this powder keg with purpose. He sought out Hilda Gadea, a Peruvian economist and member of the left-leaning APRA party who was well connected in government circles. Through her, he met high-level officials in the Arbenz administration and encountered Cuban exiles linked to Fidel Castro's 26th of July movement. He found work in the public health service, witnessed the reforms firsthand, and believed he was watching the birth of something necessary and beautiful. A revolution achieved through democratic means, proof that change need not require violence if leaders possessed both courage and popular support. He was about to learn how naive that belief truly was. The United States had been watching Guatemala with growing alarm. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and CIA Director Allen Dulles, both former partners of United Fruit's main law firm in Washington, convinced President Eisenhower that Guatemala was becoming a communist beachhead in America's backyard. Never mind that Arbenzi's land reforms affected fewer than 2,000 holdings out of 341,000 landowners. Never mind that the reforms were designed to address grotesque inequality, not implement Soviet-style collectivization. The United States saw only the specter of communism and the wounded pride of American corporate interests. Something had to be done. Alternating PBPB success began in earnest in 1954. The CIA recruited Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas, a disgruntled Guatemalan officer, to lead a counter-revolutionary force. They armed his troops, provided air support with CIA-piloted planes, and orchestrated a campaign of psychological warfare designed to create the impression of overwhelming force while deploying relatively few actual soldiers. Radio Liberation broadcast propaganda. CIA aircraft bombed strategic targets. Spies within the Guatemalan military worked to undermine Arbenzi's authority and demoralize his supporters. The entire operation was predicated on a simple calculation. They did not need to militarily defeat Guatemala's army. They only needed to make that army believe defeat was inevitable. Ernesto watched all of this unfold with growing horror and rage. He volunteered to fight, joining a militia organized by a Guatemalan communist youth group. But Arbenz, hoping to prevent mass bloodshed, refused to distribute weapons to the militias. It was a fatal hesitation born from human decency in a game where decency carried no weight. On June 27, 1954, as CIA planes bombed Guatemala City and rebel forces that numbered only in the hundreds somehow inspired a coup by claiming overwhelming strength, Arbenz resigned and fled to the Mexican embassy. Disrigo took refuge in the Argentine embassy, but his mind found no shelter. What he had witnessed was a masterclass in imperial power, in how the United States maintained control over Latin America, not through direct occupation, but through carefully orchestrated violence that maintained plausible deniability. The lesson was searingly clear. Reform through democratic means was possible only until it threatened American interests. Then the bombs would come, the CIA operatives would appear, and another elected government would fall. Faced in those weeks hiding in the embassy, something hardened in Ernesto Guevara. The romantic idealist who believed in gradual change through legal channels died in Guatemala, buried alongside the victims of the La Cubra explosion and the dreams of a democratic path to justice. What emerged from that crucible was a revolutionary, convinced that armed struggle was not a choice but a necessity, that power would never voluntarily cede its advantages, that empire understood only one language, and that the oppressed of Latin America would remain oppressed until they picked up guns and fought. Years later, when people asked how an Argentine doctor became a guerrilla leader willing to execute prisoners and advocate violence, the answer could always be traced back to Guatemala. He had watched democracy assassinated. He had seen reform murdered. He had witnessed firsthand how the United States treated nations that dared demand control over their own resources. And he had drawn his conclusions. If the only path to liberation ran through violence, then violence it would be. Clang from the Argentine embassy, he eventually secured safe passage to Mexico City. He was 25 years old, newly radicalized, and angry enough to reshape the world or die trying. In Mexico, he married Hilda Gadea and tried to build some semblance of normal life. But normalcy held no appeal for a man who had decided that capitalism was a cancer and revolution the only cure. He worked odd jobs, took photographs, conducted medical research, and waited for something, though he couldn't quite name what that something was. Then, in late summer 1955, he was introduced to a daring, exiled Cuban rebel leader committed to freeing his country from a dictator. The rebel's name was Fidel Castro, and their meeting would change the trajectory of the 20th century. The encounter happened at a gathering in the home of Maria Antonia Gonzalez in Mexico City. Castro had recently been released from prison in Cuba after his failed assault on the Moncada barracks, an ambitious attack that had turned into a bloodbath, landing him and his surviving conspirators in cells where Batista's regime expected them to rot. But Castro possessed a gift for turning failure into mythology, and his courtroom defense speech had made him famous across Cuba. Batista, in a miscalculation of historic proportions, granted amnesty to the surviving Moncada attackers. Castro fled to Mexico to plan his return. When Ernesto and Fidel met that evening, they talked through the night, their conversation lasting nearly 10 hours. Two men from different worlds discovered they spoke the same revolutionary language. Castro was all passion and political instinct, a natural leader who commanded rooms simply by entering them. Ernesto was the theorist, the ideologue who could articulate what Castro instinctively felt. One was impulsive and emotional, the other thoughtful and analytical. One was devoted entirely to Cuba, the other envisioned continental revolution. But they shared a burning conviction that armed struggle was necessary and that Batista's dictatorship in Cuba presented the perfect target. But by dawn, Ernesto had made his decision. By the small hours of that night, I had become one of the future expeditionaries, he would later record. Just like that, an Argentine doctor became a Cuban revolutionary, bound to a cause not his own by birth, but entirely his own by choice. The dynamic between Castro and Guevara was electric from the start. Journalist Georgie Ann Geyer would later write that their partnership resembled other historic duos. It was like Lenin and Trotsky, like Hitler and Goebbels, like Mao Zedong and Zhu De. This comparison, deliberately provocative, captured something true. Great movements often arise from the combustion of two different kinds of genius. Without Ernesto Guevara, Fidel Castro might never have embraced communism. Without Fidel Castro, Ernesto Guevara might have remained a Marxist theoretician, an intellectual writing about revolution rather than making it. Castro named his movement the 26th of July, commemorating the date of the Moncada attack, and began recruiting men for an invasion of Cuba. Ernesto joined as the expedition's doctor, though both he and Fidel understood his medical degree was less important than his commitment to revolutionary violence. They trained in the mountains outside Mexico City, enduring conditions designed to prepare them for guerrilla warfare in Cuba's Sierra Maestra. Despite his asthma, Ernesto outperformed every Cuban recruit, his determination overpowering his lungs' limitations. In summer 1956, Mexican authorities discovered the group's weapons cache and arrested them. Ernesto's fervent Marxist-Leninist declarations during interrogation extended everyone's jail time by weeks. Castro would later joke about this with exasperation and affection, but eventually they were released and preparations continued. On October 10, 1956, Castro purchased a yacht named Granma, built to hold 12 passengers, for $4,000. They would cram 82 fighters onto that vessel, along with weapons, ammunition, and enough idealism to fill an ocean. The Granma departed Tuxpan on the night of November 25, 1956. The weather was abominable, the sea rough, the yacht overladen to the point of comedy if the stakes hadn't been so high. Over the next 7 days, 82 men suffered conditions that tested their revolutionary commitment. Severe seasickness afflicted nearly everyone. The boat leaked. Food ran short. On the last day, The navigator fell overboard and had to be rescued in a search that risked exposure. When dawn broke on December 2nd, they were running behind schedule and the Cuban Coast Guard was alerted. Fidel ordered the yacht to land immediately at the nearest point. That nearest point was not a beach, but a mangrove swamp near Playa Las Coloradas. They crashed into a sandbar, forcing everyone to wade ashore through mud, thick undergrowth, and waters filled with small crabs that made every step precarious. Much of their food, ammunition, and medicine had to be abandoned. They regrouped inland, 82 soggy revolutionaries who had just executed possibly the worst military landing in history, and began moving toward the Sierra Maestra mountains. If the Cuban army found them now, weak and disorganized and barely armed, the revolution would end before it truly began. 3 days later, at a place called Alegría de Pio, Batista's forces attacked. The revolutionaries were dispersed, scattered, hunted. Most were killed or captured. Ernesto was wounded in the neck, bleeding and separated from his comrades. In that chaotic moment, he faced a choice that would become symbolic of his transformation. Beside him lay a box of ammunition and his medical supplies. He could only carry one. The doctor chose the ammunition. When the survivors finally regrouped in the Sierra Maestra, they counted their number, somewhere between 12 and 20 men, depending on which account you believe. Castro looked at this pathetic remnant of his invasion force and declared with characteristic audacity, "Now we are going to win." It should have been laughable. Against all logic and military common sense, he would prove correct. And their university. The Sierra Maestra range in southeastern Cuba offered terrain that favored guerrilla tactics, steep slopes, dense forest, limited roads, and a population of impoverished peasants who had every reason to hate Batista's government and few reasons to trust it. Here, in this remote laboratory of revolution, the survivors of the Granma landing transformed themselves from hunted fugitives into a fighting force capable of overthrowing a government. Ernesto distinguished himself immediately. Despite his persistent asthma, he pushed himself harder than anyone, earning Castro's trust and admiration. He became one of only 2 comandantes in the rebel army, the other being Fidel himself. His column conducted raids against army outposts, ambushed supply convoys, and gradually built a reputation for tactical brilliance. The revolutionaries adopted a policy regarding captured soldiers that proved both humanitarian and strategically sound. They rarely executed enlisted men who surrendered. Instead, they treated captured soldiers decently and released them. This practice served multiple purposes. It created propaganda showing the rebels as honorable fighters rather than terrorists. It meant that future enemies would be more likely to surrender rather than fight to the death. And it allowed the revolutionaries to maintain the moral high ground, at least in some eyes. However, deserters from their own ranks received no such mercy. Life in the mountains was brutal, and the temptation to flee was constant. Castro and Guevara dealt with desertion through summary trials and executions, establishing a discipline born from necessity but revealing the ruthlessness that would later characterize their governance. Years later, when critics accused Ernesto of being a killer, this was one of the periods they pointed to. The comandante, who personally ordered the execution of rebels he deemed insufficiently loyal, or who had betrayed the revolution through cowardice. The war spread beyond the mountains. The 26th of July movement maintained urban networks that conducted sabotage, gathered intelligence, and recruited new fighters. These operations, led by figures like Frank Pais, were crucial to keeping the revolution supplied and connected to Cuba's cities. Without the urban underground support, the Sierra Maestra column would have been isolated and easily contained. Castro understood the power of media. He established Radio Rebelde, broadcasting messages that reached across Cuba and beyond. He welcomed foreign journalists, most notably Herbert Matthews of the New York Times, who published an interview that proved Castro was alive, despite government claims to the contrary, and portrayed the revolution in sympathetic terms. These propaganda victories mattered as much as military ones. They allowed the revolution to claim momentum even when its actual strength remained limited. Ernesto established a newspaper, El Cubano Libre, and wrote articles articulating revolutionary ideology. He taught literacy to fighters who had never learned to read. He organized supply chains and medical care. He was simultaneously military commander, political commissar, educator, and theorist. The revolution became not just his cause, but his identity. During this period, he also began to be called Che, an Argentine expression roughly equivalent to hey or mate, which his Cuban comrades adopted as a nickname. The name stuck. Ernesto Guevara was becoming Che Guevara, and with that transformation, a myth was being born. By 1958, Batista's army was crumbling from within. Soldiers had no enthusiasm for fighting fellow Cubans on behalf of a corrupt dictatorship. Officers were demoralized, desertions increased. The United States, which had initially supported Batista, began to distance itself as the tide turned. In December 1958, Castro ordered a final offensive. While Fidel led one force against eastern targets, Ernesto's column was tasked with capturing Santa Clara, the capital of Las Villas province, and a strategic crossroads that connected eastern and western Cuba. The capture of Santa Clara would require genius or luck, or both. Batista's forces in the city numbered over 3,000 troops. Ernesto had roughly 300 fighters. On paper, the odds were absurd. But wars are not won on paper, and Ernesto understood something crucial. Batista's army was defeated psychologically before the first shot was fired. On December 28th, chapter with Thirst 1, Ernesto's column approached Santa Clara from the coastal port of Caibarien. The journey was marked by scenes that would have been impossible a year earlier. Crowds of peasants cheering them, government troops deserting their posts without resistance, a sense that history itself had chosen a side, and victory was inevitable. Ernesto wore his arm in a sling, having fallen off a wall during earlier fighting, but injury did nothing to diminish his tactical clarity. He divided his forces into two columns as they reached the city's outskirts. The defenders, commanded by Colonel Casillas Lumpuy, were numerous but demoralized. And then came Batista's desperate gamble. An armored train, loaded with weapons, ammunition, and supplies to reinforce the garrison. This train represented the government's last hope for turning the tide. It contained 373 soldiers and $4 million worth of munitions. Everything needed to hold Santa Clara indefinitely. Ernesto recognized immediately that capturing this train would break not just Santa Clara, but the entire regime. He mobilized tractors from the university's agricultural school to use as improvised engineering equipment. Under cover of darkness and combat, rebels tore up sections of railroad track. When the armored train approached, several cars derailed, leaving soldiers trapped in steel boxes that were armored on the sides but vulnerable from above. What happened next became legend. Rebels pelted the train with Molotov cocktails. The armored plating that was supposed to protect the soldiers turned their cars into ovens. Fire and smoke filled the derailed carriages. Soldiers faced a choice between burning alive or surrendering. At 7 p.m. on December 30th, 1958, the train and its defenders surrendered to the rebels. Some accounts suggest the surrender was prearranged, that officers were paid to give up without genuine fight. These allegations have persisted for decades, with claims that Colonel Rosell sold the armored train for somewhere between $350,000 and $1 million. If true, this would diminish Ernesto's tactical brilliance, suggesting his greatest military victory was actually a bribe. The truth remains contested. What is undeniable is the psychological impact. News of the train's capture spread across Cuba like wildfire. Soldiers in other garrisons, already doubting their cause, began surrendering en masse. The revolution suddenly seemed unstoppable. By mid-afternoon on December 31st, Ernesto announced over Radio Rebelde that the last troops in Santa Clara had surrendered. The city had fallen. Within 12 hours, Batista fled Cuba for the Dominican Republic, taking with him whatever wealth he could carry, and leaving behind a government that collapsed like a house built on sand. On January 1, 1959, while Cubans celebrated in the streets, Fidel Castro's forces marched toward Havana to claim their triumph. The rebels had won. A guerrilla force numbering in the hundreds had defeated an army of thousands. A revolution that began with a disastrous beach landing and a handful of survivors in the mountains had toppled a dictatorship backed by the United States. The impossible had become reality. And Ernesto Che Guevara, the Argentine doctor who had chosen ammunition over medical supplies in a desperate moment at Alegría de Pio, was now Comandante Che Guevara, revolutionary hero, architect of victory, and one of the three most powerful men in Cuba's new government. But victory, as he would soon learn, brought responsibilities far darker than those found in mountain warfare. The revolution's triumph should have been a moment of pure celebration. Havana erupted in joy as Castro's bearded rebels entered the capital, crowds swarming the streets, old regime officials fleeing for airports or embassies, a nation transforming overnight from dictatorship to revolutionary government. But revolutions are not finished when the shooting stops. They continue through courts and trials and executions, and it is in this aftermath that the moral complexity of revolutionary violence becomes undeniable. Fidel Castro named Ernesto Guevara commander of La Cabaña fortress, a colonial-era military prison overlooking Havana harbor. The appointment came with explicit instructions: implement revolutionary justice against those who had served Batista's regime, particularly members of the Bureau de Represión de Actividades Comunistas, the secret police who had tortured and murdered opposition figures. La Cabaña would become the stage for tribunals that judged war criminals, collaborators, informants, and anyone the new government deemed an enemy of the revolution. The legal framework invoked was the Ley de la Sierra, a 19th-century Cuban penal code that included the death penalty for serious crimes. The revolutionary government extended this law across all of Cuba and to all those accused of war crimes during Batista's regime. The Cuban Ministry of Justice argued this followed the same procedure as the Nuremberg trials, where Nazi officials faced justice for atrocities committed during World War II. Whether this comparison held moral weight would depend largely on who was judging. Ernesto took to his new role with the same intense dedication he had brought to guerrilla warfare. The tribunals at La Cabaña were conducted by panels of army officers, assessors, and respected local citizens. Evidence was presented, judgments were rendered, and in many cases, the penalty was death by firing squad. Ernesto presided over the appellate court, reviewing cases where convicted prisoners appealed their sentences. Biographers and historians who have studied this period note a disturbing fact. Ernesto Guevara never overturned a death sentence. Not once. Every appeal that reached his desk was denied. Blackmail of executions at La Cabaña during Ernesto's tenure has been fiercely debated. Some sources cite 55 to 105 deaths directly attributable to orders he gave or approved. Others claim higher numbers, ranging up to 176 or even 500 when extending the timeline beyond his official 5-month command. The revolutionary government maintains that all executions were legally justified, that the condemned were guilty of genuine crimes, that Cuba's people overwhelmingly supported these trials. A survey at the time showed 93% public approval. On January 22, 1959, a Universal newsreel broadcast showed Fidel Castro asking an estimated 1 million Cubans gathered in Havana whether they approved of the executions. The crowd's response was a thunderous, "Sí." Yes. But numbers and public approval do not answer the moral questions that haunt this period. What of due process? What of the individual cases where guilt might have been ambiguous? What of the testimony from those who witnessed the executions, who describe Ernesto's demeanor as cold and methodical, who say he attended firing squads and showed no emotion as men fell before bullets? And what of his own words, written in a letter to Luis Paredes Lopez in Buenos Aires on February 5, 1959. The executions by firing squads are not only a necessity for the people of Cuba, but also an imposition of the people. Rosa Hernandez, mother of one executed prisoner, later recounted asking Ernesto for clemency for her son. According to her testimony, Ernesto picked up the phone in her presence and ordered the execution to proceed that very night. She became hysterical with grief and was dragged out by guards. Such stories exist alongside accounts of others who claim Ernesto pardoned as many prisoners as possible, that he showed humanity within brutal constraints. The truth, as with so much of Ernesto's life, depends on which witnesses you believe and which historical lens you apply. Suppressing what cannot be disputed is that Ernesto Guevara had become a hardened man who had no qualms about the death penalty or summary justice. If executing enemies of the revolution was necessary to defend Cuba's transformation, he would not be swayed by humanitarian or political arguments. The doctor who once treated patients had become the revolutionary who ordered them shot. This transformation was not sudden, but gradual, built from Guatemala's lessons and guerrilla warfare's demands, and the conviction that revolution required ruthlessness. Colonel Rojas, chief of police in Santa Clara, whose officers had resisted until the battle's last moments, provides a particularly disturbing example. After his capture, Rojas's family received a letter offering safe passage, implying he would be spared and eventually released. Instead, on January 7, 1959, Ernesto ordered Rojas's execution. The scene was filmed. When footage aired on television, Rojas's family initially felt relief seeing him alive. Then they watched in horror as he was placed before a firing squad and shot. This became one of the first executions ever broadcast on television, transmitted around the world, creating an image of revolutionary justice that simultaneously inspired and horrified viewers. After several months at La Cabaña, Ernesto suffered a violent asthma attack and withdrew to recover at a villa in Tarará. There, he began writing Guerrilla Warfare, the manual that would codify his tactical philosophy and influence revolutionary movements worldwide. In February 1959, the Cuban government proclaimed him a Cuban citizen by birth, in recognition of his role in the revolution's triumph. He divorced Hilda Gadea, telling her he was involved with another woman. On June 2nd, he married Aleida March, a beautiful Cuban revolutionary who would bear him 4 children and remain with him until his death. The revolution appointed him to positions of enormous power despite his lack of relevant experience. He became president of the National Bank of Cuba, famously signing currency simply Che, demonstrating his contempt for both bureaucracy and the seriousness with which capitalist society treats money. He later became Minister of Industry, attempting to implement his vision of a socialist economy driven by moral incentives rather than material gain. Workers would volunteer for collective benefit rather than personal profit. Dedication and revolutionary fervor would replace wages as motivation. Ernesto led by example, working endless hours at his ministry, volunteering for construction projects, cutting sugarcane alongside laborers. His economic management was, to put it charitably, unsuccessful. By 1963, even a CIA classified report acknowledged that Ernesto had brought the economy to its lowest point since Castro came to power. His theories about moral incentives proved inadequate to overcome practical realities. People needed to eat, industries required expertise he lacked, and revolutionary enthusiasm could not substitute for sound economic planning. His good looks, acerbic humor, and willingness to criticize the revolution's shortcomings earned him affection among many Cubans. But affection could not compensate for an economy in decline. His relationship with the Soviet Union grew increasingly strained. After Nikita Khrushchev removed nuclear missiles from Cuba during the 1962 missile crisis without consulting Castro, Ernesto questioned Moscow's commitment to international socialism. He publicly criticized the Soviets for insisting Cuba continue specializing in sugar production rather than diversifying its economy. At a gathering in Algiers, he called socialist countries accomplices of imperialist exploitation. Such statements did not endear him to Cuba's primary economic patron. Outside Cuba, Ernesto's fame skyrocketed. Leftist intellectuals and radical youth movements embraced him as a symbol of pure revolutionary commitment, untainted by the compromises and corruption that had undermined other socialist experiments. His image adorned protest banners from Paris to Berkeley. Students and activists quoted his writings. He represented possibility, that one person committed to justice could truly change the world, that armed struggle could liberate the oppressed, that capitalism was not inevitable, but merely one system among many that could be overthrown. But Ernesto was restless. Being a government minister, attending diplomatic receptions, managing industries and banks, all of this felt like betrayal of his fundamental nature. He was not a bureaucrat or an economist or a statesman. He was a revolutionary, and revolutionaries needed battlefields. Cuba's revolution was consolidating, becoming institutionalized, settling into patterns that looked disturbingly like those found in other socialist states. The Soviet Union's influence grew while revolutionary purity diminished. Ernesto saw this happening, and it sickened him. In an emotional farewell letter to Fidel Castro, Ernesto renounced all his official posts, gave up his Cuban citizenship, and prepared to leave Cuba to fight imperialism in new fields of battle. The letter, which Castro would make public in October 1965, was simultaneously a resignation and a manifesto. "I have fulfilled the part of my duty that tied me to the Cuban Revolution in its territory," he wrote, "and I say goodbye to you, to the comrades, to your people, who are now mine." Disappearing from Cuba became an international guessing game. Reports placed him in Ethiopia, Vietnam, the Congo, anywhere insurgency flickered. The truth was simultaneously more specific and more catastrophic than speculation suggested. He had gone to Africa, convinced that the Congo could become the crucible for continental revolution. It would prove to be one of the greatest failures of his life. On April 24, 1965, Ernesto Guevara and 13 Cuban fighters crossed from Tanzania into the eastern Congo under cover of darkness. They traveled with false documents, Ernesto using the name Ramon Benitez, their mission so secret that even most of Castro's government didn't know the details. The plan was ambitious to the point of delusion. Support the Simba rebellion against the Congolese government, establish liberated zones that would serve as bases for spreading revolution throughout Africa, demonstrate that guerrilla warfare could succeed against neo-colonial regimes backed by Western powers. From the beginning, everything went wrong. Ernesto later titled his diary of this period with brutal honesty. "This is the story of a failure." Those words would haunt subsequent analysts who tried to understand how the hero of Santa Clara became a footnote in African history, how the master tactician who helped overthrow Batista achieved nothing but embarrassment in the Congo. The Congolese rebel leadership, which was supposed to coordinate with the Cubans, proved absent or incompetent, or both. Laurent Kabila, who would decades later seize power and rename the country, spent more time in bars and brothels than planning military operations. When he did appear, his forces were poorly trained, undisciplined, and prone to tribal infighting that made unified action impossible. The rebels believed in dawa, a ritual that supposedly made recipients immune to enemy bullets. This magical thinking made tactical planning nearly impossible. How do you coordinate an ambush when your supposed allies believe magic protects them from gunfire? Cultural clashes extended beyond military operations. Ernesto, despite his revolutionary commitment and his choice to lead a predominantly Afro-Cuban force, could not escape being a white foreigner trying to lead African fighters. His arrogance, however unintentional, poisoned relationships from the start. He arrived uninvited, expecting to take command rather than serve as an advisor. He showed little interest in understanding local customs or addressing internal Congolese problems. Language barriers compounded everything. Ernesto spoke neither Swahili nor the various dialects his supposed comrades used. His Spanish and French proved useless for building the trust and communication guerrilla warfare requires. Congolese commanders complained that when Ernesto rebuked them, it felt like colonialism returned, like Belgian officers once again treating Africans as children needing European guidance. Ernesto recognized this dynamic intellectually. In his diary, he acknowledged the pain Congolese felt when a white man rebuked them like in the old days, and admitted, "My being white influenced matters." But recognition did not translate to changed behavior. Self-awareness, it turns out, is not the same as adaptation. Pragmatic, the Cubans also witnessed practices that horrified them. Congolese fighters practiced cannibalism, consuming hearts and livers of fallen enemies as part of battle rituals. This was not starvation or survival, but cultural practice, something the Marxist revolutionaries from Havana had no framework to understand or accept. The juxtaposition was stark. They had come to fight imperialism and found themselves in a conflict where their supposed allies engaged in practices that seemed to validate every colonial narrative about African savagery. Military operations failed consistently. The Congo avoided actual consent constantly, and ILA repeatedly failed to provide supplies or backup during operations. Government forces, supported by Western mercenary pilots and advisors, pushed back against the insurgency with increasing effectiveness. By October 1965, Ernesto was writing desperate assessments to Castro. "It's not really weapons that are lacking here. Indeed, there are too many armed men, and what is lacking are soldiers." The mission collapsed. On November 20th, 1965, Ernesto and his surviving Cubans retreated across Lake Tanganyika back into Tanzania, evacuating under cover of night with government forces close behind. If Ernesto had been captured, his identity as Tatu would have been revealed, exposing Cuba's involvement in the conflict and creating an international scandal. They escaped, but barely. "There was not a single trace of grandeur in that retreat," Ernesto wrote bitterly. He spent weeks hiding in the Cuban embassy in Dar es Salaam, writing his self-critical diary and trying to understand what went wrong. His analysis was thorough and painful. The fundamental problem, he concluded, was that Congo lacked the preconditions for successful guerrilla warfare. Unlike Cuba, where peasants wanted land and workers wanted economic justice, the Congolese countryside wasn't organized around those grievances. Imperialism showed itself sporadically. Currency barely penetrated production relations. One of his comrades joked grimly that Congo possessed all the anti-conditions for revolution. Beyond that fundamental mismatch, organizational failures compounded everywhere. The Congolese revolution was inevitably doomed to failure as a result of its own internal weaknesses, he wrote, but added crucially that the inauguration of the International Proletarian Army must not be allowed to die at the first failure. Despite everything, he still believed in exporting revolution. He had just learned that good intentions and tactical brilliance were insufficient when local conditions didn't support the guerrilla warfare model. In November 1966, Ernesto returned to Cuba in deep disguise, so transformed that even close colleagues struggled to recognize him. Castro's government hid his presence. For months, only a Leda march and a tiny circle knew he was in Cuba. The revolutionary hero had become a liability. Cuba was increasingly dependent on the Soviet Union, which disapproved of Ernesto's freelance revolutionary adventures and his public criticism. Meanwhile, Ernesto's ego and his commitment to spreading revolution made him unsuitable for quiet retirement. Something had to be done. Fidel Castro suggested Bolivia, not Argentina, where Ernesto had originally hoped to spark revolution in his homeland, but Bolivia, where conditions seemed more favorable and where failure would be less strategically damaging to Cuba. The suggestion carried the weight of command disguised as proposal. Ernesto accepted. After 6 months of training in the Cuban mountains, the legendary rebel entered Bolivia in November 1966, disguised as a businessman, determined to turn the Bolivian Andes into another Sierra Maestra. It would be his last campaign.
Prepara seemed promising.
Bolivia shared borders with Argentina, Brazil, Peru, Chile, and Paraguay, potentially allowing revolution to spread across the continent from a single, liberated center. The country's indigenous majority suffered oppression and poverty that should have created revolutionary consciousness. The mountains offered terrain familiar from Cuba's Sierra Maestra. On paper, Bolivia looked ideal. Reality proved crushingly different. The local population did not rally to Ernesto's cause. Bolivia's indigenous majority, whose grievances should have made them natural allies, viewed these foreign guerrillas with suspicion or indifference. The Moscow-oriented Bolivian Communist Party, which might have provided crucial support, instead opposed the expedition and refused assistance. They saw Ernesto as a dangerous adventurer whose tactics would provoke government repression against the broader left. Worse, word of the guerrilla force reached both the Bolivian military and the CIA almost immediately. The element of surprise that is crucial to guerrilla warfare never existed. Instead, Ernesto and his fighters were hunted from the start by a Bolivian army battalion specially trained in counterinsurgency tactics by American advisors. These rangers understood jungle warfare, had modern equipment, and most critically, enjoyed better intelligence about the guerrillas than the guerrillas possessed about them. Ernesto's force began with about 120 fighters, but numbers declined steadily through combat, capture, desertion, and disease. His own health deteriorated as asthma and dysentery ravaged a body already weakened by years of guerrilla living. By July 1967, his diary entries showed desperate awareness of approaching doom. Bolivia, July 1967. The negative aspects prevail, including the failure to make contact with the outside. We are down to 22 men, 3 of whom are disabled, including myself. By September, as the Rangers closed in, he commanded only 16 sick and weary fighters. Some analysts believe Fidel Castro abandoned Ernesto in Bolivia, allowing the revolutionary liability to meet his inevitable end without actively betraying him, but also without providing the support that might have saved him. Whether through active abandonment or passive neglect, Ernesto received no reinforcements, no supplies, no communication that might have allowed retreat or reorganization. He fought on because fighting was what he knew, but the outcome became increasingly certain. On October 8, 1967, in a narrow valley called El Lluro, near the village of La Higuera, the Bolivian Rangers finally cornered what remained of Ernesto's guerrilla group. In the firefight that followed, Ernesto's rifle was destroyed by a bullet. His legs were wounded. Struggling to escape through the brush, he was captured by soldiers who initially didn't recognize who they had caught. As they dragged him away, Ernesto identified himself. "I am Che Guevara and worth more to you, alive than dead." He was correct about his value, but wrong about their intentions. They took him to a schoolhouse in La Higuera, locking him in a small room while the Bolivian government and their American advisors decided his fate. Throughout that night, he was interrogated by officers trying to extract information about remaining guerrilla cells and Cuban involvement. CIA agent Felix Rodriguez was present, tasked with keeping the prisoner alive for further intelligence gathering. Rodriguez would later recount that his orders from the CIA were clear: capture Che Guevara and transport him for interrogation. But Rodriguez was not in command. The Bolivian military's high command made their decision independent of American preferences. On the morning of October 9, 1967, orders came from Bolivian Army headquarters: execute the prisoner. Sergeant Mario Terán was chosen for the task, or more accurately, drew the short straw among soldiers, none of whom wanted to pull the trigger. He entered the schoolroom at approximately 1:15 p.m., carrying an M2 automatic rifle. Ernesto, sitting on the floor, his legs wounded and his breathing labored, looked up at the man who would kill him. Accounts differ about his last words. Some say he told Terán to be brave, that he was only killing a man. Others report different final statements. What is certain is that Terán fired a burst of bullets into Ernesto's chest and throat, deliberately avoiding the head to make the body recognizable. Ernesto Che Guevara died in that schoolhouse at age 39. His body was transported by helicopter to Valle Grande, where it was washed and displayed on a table at the local hospital. Journalists and officials photographed the corpse. The image that resulted, Ernesto's body laid out, eyes open, beard unkempt, chest riddled with bullet wounds, created comparisons to depictions of Christ. Here was the revolutionary martyr, killed by forces of empire and reaction, his sacrifice complete. His hands were severed and sent to Cuba for fingerprint confirmation. His body was buried secretly in an unmarked grave, the Bolivian government fearing his burial site might become a shrine. They were correct to worry. Even in death, even buried anonymously, Ernesto Guevara was becoming something more than human. He was becoming an icon. 30. For 30 years, Ernesto's body lay hidden in an unmarked grave somewhere near Valle Grande. The Bolivian government refused to reveal the location, understanding that martyrs buried become rallying points for future revolutions. But in 1997, a team of researchers finally located a mass grave at the Valle Grande airport. Among the remains was a skeleton missing its hands. DNA testing confirmed what the world already knew. Che Guevara had been found. On July 12, 1997, his remains were transported back to Cuba with full military honors. Fidel Castro, aging now but still commanding, presided over the burial ceremony in Santa Clara, the city where Ernesto had achieved his greatest military victory. Thousands of Cubans attended. The revolutionary who had renounced his Cuban citizenship to export revolution across the world came home to be interred alongside his fallen comrades in a mausoleum that doubled as memorial and museum. An eternal flame was lit. The myth was complete. But by 1997, the myth had long since transcended the man. On March 5, 1960, photographer Alberto Corda had snapped 2 frames of Ernesto at a funeral service in Havana for victims of the La Cubra explosion. In the photograph, Ernesto gazed into the middle distance, his face showing what Corda described as absolute implacability mixed with anger and pain. He wore his trademark beret. His eyes carried intensity that seemed to look through the viewer towards some distant revolutionary horizon. The photograph was not immediately published or celebrated. It hung on Corda's studio wall for years, seen by few. Then, in early 1967, Italian publisher Giangiacomo Feltrinelli came to Cuba seeking a portrait of Ernesto for a book cover. Corda pointed to the photograph on his wall, saying it was the best he had ever taken. Feltrinelli ordered 2 prints. When he came to collect them, Corda, as a friend of the revolution, refused payment. Those 2 prints went viral in the pre-digital age. The photograph appeared in Paris Match magazine without credit. Irish artist Jim Fitzpatrick used it to create a high-contrast poster in red and black, which he distributed freely at rock concerts and protest rallies across Europe. By the time Ernesto was executed in Bolivia in October 1967, his face had already begun its journey toward becoming the most reproduced image in photographic history, rivaling the Mona Lisa and Marilyn Monroe in ubiquity. The Maryland Institute College of Art would call the photograph the world's most famous photograph and a symbol of the 20th century. It appeared on T-shirts and posters, in art galleries and dorm rooms, on city walls and in museum exhibitions. It became divorced from its context, separated from the man it depicted, transformed into a generic symbol of rebellion that could mean whatever the viewer needed it to mean. Image represents pure revolutionary commitment, the willingness to sacrifice everything for justice, the courage to fight empire regardless of consequences. For others, it represents naive idealism that justified violence, led to economic disaster, and left authoritarian regimes wrapped in leftist rhetoric. For still others, particularly younger generations who know nothing of his actual life, the image is simply cool, a vintage aesthetic divorced from politics entirely. The commercialization of Ernesto's face represents a profound irony that he would have despised. The anti-capitalist revolutionary became a capitalist product. His image sells vodka and beer, adorns fashion accessories and cell phone cases, generates billions of dollars in revenue for corporations he would have considered enemies. When Smirnoff Vodka used his image in an advertisement, Korda sued and won an out-of-court settlement of $50,000, which he immediately donated to the Cuban healthcare system. If Che were still alive, Korda said, he would have done the same. Alternating Korda's lawsuit could not stop the flood. The image had escaped all control, becoming public domain by practice, if not by law. It mutated across cultures. Che Christ with halo, gay pride Che with rainbow colors, feminist Che, environmentalist Che. Every cause appropriating his face to give itself revolutionary credibility. The transformation from violent revolutionary to fashion statement was complete. Submerged writer Edmundo Desnoyers offered perhaps the most balanced assessment. Che's image may be cast aside, bought and sold and deified, but it will form a part of the universal system of the revolutionary struggle and can recover its original meaning at any moment. This captures both the trivialization and the enduring power. Yes, the image has been commodified beyond recognition, but underneath the t-shirts and the marketing campaigns, something persists. The idea that one person committed to justice can challenge systems that seem invincible. His legacy remains bitterly contested. In Cuba, he is officially venerated as the heroic guerrilla. His image literally carved into the Ministry of Interior building in Havana, his memory preserved in museums and monuments. October 8th is commemorated as the Day of the Heroic Guerrilla. Schoolchildren study his writings. The government presents him as the purest expression of revolutionary values, a martyr who died fighting imperialism. Cuban exiles and critics offer a different narrative. They point to the executions at La Cabaña, to prisoners shot without due process, to the tribunals where Ernesto never overturned a death sentence. They cite testimony from political prisoners who describe torture and summary justice. They argue his economic policies devastated Cuba's economy, while his personality cult enabled authoritarian rule. To them, he is not a hero, but a war criminal whose image should inspire shame rather than admiration. Historians occupy various positions across this spectrum. Some emphasize his genuine commitment to the poor and oppressed, his willingness to sacrifice privilege and comfort, his courage in fighting what he saw as imperialism. They note that his violence occurred in context of genuine grievances and brutal repression by the regimes he opposed. Others stress that noble intentions do not excuse human rights violations, that revolutionary purity is not a license for executions, that his failures in Congo and Bolivia revealed the limits of his tactical abilities. What cannot be denied is his impact. Liberation movements across Latin America, Africa, and Asia drew inspiration from his writings and example. Guerrilla warfare tactics he helped develop influenced conflicts for decades. His book, Guerrilla Warfare, became essential reading for insurgents worldwide. Whether one views this influence as positive or negative depends entirely on one's position regarding revolutionary violence and armed struggle. His concept of the new man, the revolutionary socialist citizen motivated by moral incentives rather than material gain, influenced educational and social policies across the socialist world. The idea that people could be transformed through revolution, that capitalism's corruption of human nature was not inevitable. This vision resonated with millions who dreamed of more just societies. That these dreams often turned into nightmares, that the new man remained more aspiration than reality, this doesn't erase the power of the vision. Perhaps Ernesto's most lasting contribution is simply this: He proved that privilege can be rejected, that someone born into comfort can choose solidarity with the oppressed, that intellectuals need not remain in libraries but can join actual struggles for liberation. Whether his particular path was the right one, whether his violence was justified, whether his tactics succeeded or failed, these remain open questions. But his commitment was never in doubt. From the 2-year-old boy gasping for air in Argentina to the revolutionary executed in Bolivia, Ernesto Che Guevara lived with an intensity that most people never approach. His asthma should have limited him to a quiet life of medical practice. Instead, he traversed continents, joined revolutions, commanded armies, influenced governments, and died in pursuit of an ideal he could articulate but never fully achieve. His contradictions were profound. The doctor who ordered executions, the humanist who embraced violence, the champion of the poor who struggled with arrogance, the revolutionary who became a global brand. The motorcycle journey that began in 1952 never truly ended. It merely changed vehicles, from La Poderosa to the Granma to military jeeps in mountains across 3 continents. The road was always the point, not comfort or stability or conventional success, but movement towards some revolutionary horizon that receded as fast as he approached. He died chasing that horizon, which perhaps was the only end that ever made sense for a man who refused every limitation his body, his background, or his world tried to impose. In Santa Clara, in the mausoleum where his remains now rest, a phrase is carved above his memorial: "Hasta la victoria siempre," until victory, always. It is simultaneously a promise, a threat, and a question. Victory for whom? Victory against what? These questions remain unanswered because Ernesto Guevara, for all his writings and speeches and actions, never fully defined what victory would look like. He knew what he fought against: imperialism, capitalism, exploitation, injustice. But the vision of what he fought for remained perpetually ahead, just beyond the next battle, just past the next revolution. And so the face in Corda's photograph continues to stare into the distance, intense and implacable, seeing something the rest of us cannot quite make out. That gaze has outlasted the man, outlasted his victories and his failures, outlasted even most of the ideologies he championed. It endures because it represents something fundamental to human nature: the refusal to accept the world as it is, the conviction that change is possible, the willingness to risk everything for a vision of justice. Whether that refusal leads to liberation or tragedy, whether that conviction produces heroes or tyrants, whether that risk is noble or foolish, these remain the questions Ernesto Che Guevara's life poses to everyone who encounters his story. The answers we give reveal less about him than about ourselves, about what we value, what we're willing to sacrifice, and whether we believe that one person committed to revolution can truly transform the world. The boy who refused to let asthma define him grew into the man who refused to let empire stand unchallenged. He failed more than he succeeded. He harmed people while trying to help them. He became the icon he probably would have despised. But he lived and died according to his convictions, never wavering even when those convictions led him into deserts of failure, mountains of violence, and finally to a schoolhouse where a reluctant soldier ended his 40 years of refusing to surrender. That refusal is his legacy. Everything else, the executions and the economic failures, the military victories and the martyrdom, the iconic photograph and the commercial exploitation, all of it flows from that fundamental refusal to accept the world as unjust and do nothing. Whether we honor that refusal or condemn it, whether we see in Ernesto Che Guevara a hero or a cautionary tale, we cannot ignore him. His face won't let us. His story demands we choose complicity or resistance, acceptance or revolution, the world as it is or the world as it might be. He chose. For better and for worse, through triumph and catastrophe, until a burst of rifle fire in a Bolivian schoolhouse finally silenced a man who never stopped believing that another world was possible. Ernesto Che Guevara chose revolution. History will forever debate whether his choice was right, but no one can say he chose half-heartedly.
The road that began with a motorcycle called La Poderosa ended in a remote village called La Higuera. Between those points lay 10,000 miles, 2 continents, countless battles, and one extraordinary life that continues to challenge the world decades after it ended. That challenge is simple and devastating. What are you willing to sacrifice for what you believe? How far will you go to change injustice? At what point does revolutionary violence become indistinguishable from the violence it opposes? Ernesto Che Guevara never resolved those contradictions. He lived them until they killed him. And his face, frozen in a photograph taken 65 years ago, continues asking them of everyone who sees it. What will you do? Will you accept the world or fight to change it? And if you fight, who will you become? The questions endure. The man is gone, but the revolutionary, defiant, implacable, forever gazing toward victory that never quite arrives, remains. Hasta la victoria, siempre.